And the topic for today's lesson is present simple. Probably you have already heard of it, but today we will dive a little deeper into this verb tense. Every time that you are learning a new verb tense, it is crucial that you understand two things about it. It's like a coin that has two sides. We have the usage, how you use that verb tense, and we also have the structure, which means how you will use that. Let's take a look at on the board. We have present simple. Present simple. Okay, as I said, there are two things you need to pay attention to. The first one is the use. How to use this verb tense. In which situations do I use it? And we also need to know the structure. Okay? Use and structure. Okay, first, when do we use present simple? And what do we use present simple for? Basically, we will use it to describe a routine. A routine, of course, a routine in the present. Or a habit that you have, which are pretty much the same, right? Routine and habit. Or a fact, something that is always true in the present. Of course, we are talking about present. So the routine, the habit, or the fact, they are in the present. Okay? But what about the structure? How do we use the structure? Okay. First things first, we always need a subject in English. So you will have a subject. Remember that the subjects, they are related to the three persons of the discourse. The first person, I, or we in the plural. I. We have you as the second person, you. He, a man, about, it's the topic of what I'm talking, right? He, ele. We have she, ela, it. It's pretty much the same. It's a pronoun, but we use it for things that do not have a sex. For example, table, chair, window. They are not human beings, so we use it to describe them. We, you, and they. I hope you still remember that I is the first person, you is the second, he, she, it describe the third person. And these guys here are in the singular. And we have the persons of a plural. First person, second person, third person. But now we are describing the plural form, not the singular anymore. Okay, so we is the plural of I, you the plural of you. As they are equal, we need to understand them through a context. We always need to analyze the context to check if it's plural or singular. In the plural of he, they, if I'm talking about two men, I will say they. But if I'm talking about two women, I will say they as well. And if I'm talking about a man and a woman all together, I will say they as well. And if I am talking about a man, a door, and a woman, I will be talking about they as well. So they is the plural of he, she, and it. After this subject, we will have a verb. And this verb is in the base form. In the base form. Renan, what is base form? Look at this. We have the verbs. The infinitive in English is made when we add to before the verb. For example, I get eat. If I want to say comer, I will say to eat. This is the infinitive. Quando o verbo não está conjugado, né? Isso é o infinitivo. But here the verb is in the infinitive, And we also have the verb in the base form. When we omit to, when we take to out of this place, we have eat, and eat here is in the base form. So the verbs that we use here in the present simple to describe a routine, a habit, or a fact in the present, they are all in the base form. Let's get the verb eat. I will say, I eat, you eat, we eat, you eat, and they eat. But teacher, what happened? You skipped he, she, and it. Yes, I did, and it was on purpose. What happens here is, every time you are talking about the present, you describing a routine, a habit, or a fact, but you have a third person singular, it means he, she, or it, the verb changes a little bit. So the general rule, there are some rules here that we can follow. If it's a normal verb, we get the verb and we add s to it. And of course, I am describing the affirmative sentence. I eat, you eat. The general rule says every time you have a third person singular in present simple, we add a letter s to the verb. In this case, we will have he eats. He eats. She eats. And it eats. This is the correct way to use present simple in the affirmative. For the third person of singular, he, she, it, we need to add this extra letter s. This is something we will need, okay? But let's talk a little bit more about these rules here, the rules of the third person on singular. Third person singular. The general rule says, for he, she, it, we get the verb and we add s to it. But if this verb finishes in, and by finishing I mean the last letter, if this last letter of the verb is O, S, SS, SH, CH, or X, in these circumstances we have to add ES. ES. So if it's a normal verb, we just add s. If it's a verb for the third person of singular, and it finishes in no, s, ss, sh, ch, or x, we add es. Take a look at what happens with the verb go, for instance. Let me erase this. Let's take the verb to go. To go. In Portuguese, we have ir. To go. Verbo ir. That's very easy. We know that here we use the base form, so we drop to. Go. Go is the base form of the verb. Let's see. Eu vou, I go. Você vai. You go. Nós vamos. We go. Vocês vão. You go. They go. Eles vão. But to describe what happens for the third person of singular, he, she, it, the general rule says, okay, let's add s. But the verb go finishes in no. Look at that. It's a no. If the verb finishes in no, we need to add es to it. So the correct way to use the verb go for he, she, it is to say goes. He goes. She goes. It goes. Okay? Another something which is important for you to know is the following. If this verb finishes in y, if this last letter here is a y, you've got to analyze Which letter comes before the Y? Observe these two verbs. These two verbs here. Let's say the verb to stay and the verb, okay, to stay means ficar in português, ficar em algum lugar, okay? Não é ficar triste, ficar alegre, ficar em um lugar. For example, stay in a hotel, ficar num hotel, stay in a friend's house, ficar na casa de um amigo. This is the verb stay. But we also have the verb to study. So we can understand what happens with both of them. Study, we already know, which is the verb estudar. Look at that. If the verb finishes in Y, we need to analyze. Check the verb. If before the Y you have a vowel, like here, remember what are the vowels? We have A, E, I, O, U. A, E, I, O, U. These are the vowels. If before my Y I have a vowel, nothing happens. We only add S normally. For example, let's use verb stay here. I stay, you stay, but he stays. I added this S. She stays. It stays. Good. So with stay, nothing happens. We only add S, stays. Why that? Because before the Y we have a vowel. But if you take a look at the verb study, before the Y we don't have a vowel anymore. We have a consonant. And if before this Y you have a consonant, the rule says you need to drop the Y. So bye, Y. And we add IES. What happens is we drop the Y and we add IES. So, if I want to say ele estuda, he studies. He studies. The pronunciation doesn't change. Study, studies. We just add this S at the end of it. Okay, let's use the verb study here. And I'll use it for all the persons in the discourse. I study, it's normal. You study, normal. We study, you study, they study, doesn't change. But for he, she, and it, studies, IES at the end. Why is that? Because the verb finishes in Y, and before the Y we've got a consonant, so we drop the Y. She studies, it studies. All right, so here we're done with the affirmative form of verbs in the present simple, okay? But let's take a look at what happens if instead of using an affirmative sentence, I want to use a negative sentence. Because we don't speak only by using the affirmative, we also use negative sentences and questions. If you have, oh, just a minute, I'll be back in a while. Came back. In the negative, something will happen. Between the subject and the verb, we will add something. So we need a subject, but in between the subject and the verb, we need to use either don't or doesn't. Don't or doesn't. Repeat after me. Don't, doesn't. That is the way that we transform these sentences here into negative sentences. Of course, don't is the contracted form. Instead of using don't, we can use do not. The two forms are okay. Okay? This one is used more when we want to give more emphasis to something that we are describing, or when we're writing. When we're speaking normally, like talking to a friend in a day-to-day conversation, we just use don't, okay? Or doesn't. But if you're writing, you can use do not, and for doesn't, you can use does not. It's also possible, okay? They are the same. I will stick to don't and doesn't because they are more common. They happen more frequently in the language. What happens? Good. We have all the persons of the discourse. I, you, he, she, it, we, you, and they. What happens is, for everybody but the third person and the singular, we will use don't. So, I don't, you don't, we don't, you don't, and they don't. After that, we will use the verb. Watch out. This verb here is always in the base form. Like here. But here, you see what happens for he, she, it, it's not base form. For he, she, it, we need to do something. Either we just add an s if it's a normal verb, or if the verb finishes in o, s, 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 h, c, h, x, we need to add es. If the verb finishes in y, we need to analyze it before we have a vowel or a consonant. If you have a vowel, we just add s normally. And if we have a consonant, we drop the y and we add ies. Okay, this is in the affirmative. In the negative, for he, she, and it, we use doesn't. Doesn't. So, I don't, you don't, but he, she, it doesn't. And after that, we use the verb. Pay attention that here the verb doesn't come with the s. Observe, if I want to say, eu não estudo, I don't study. You don't study. We don't study. You don't study. They don't study. But what about here? What happens to the third person singular? Is it correct to say he doesn't, he studies? Is it correct? No, this is not correct. But why, teacher? You told us right now that for the third person singular we need to change the verb. Yeah, but this only happens in the affirmative. Because in the negative, you see that doesn't is already marking the difference. Doesn't is already showing us that it's all about a third person and singular. So in this case, we don't change the verb. The verb continues, the verb remains in the base form. Study. She doesn't study. It doesn't study. So in the negative, it's very easy because, we have just to change don't and doesn't. We have to choose them. Of course, for he, she, it doesn't. Very simple, okay? So we've covered the affirmative, we've covered the negative. Let's talk a little bit about the question. And that's interesting. It will help you, start conversations. I hope it's going to be helpful for you. Let's see how this thing goes. This is not affirmative anymore. This is a question. Are you able to understand me? Can you understand me? This is good. If you don't understand me, please tell me during our meetings, during our live classes, tell me. What happens here is we will change the order of some of the elements here. We have a subject, of course, then we have a verb, but before this verb, we will have to use an auxiliary. And this auxiliary will be either do or does. Observe the order. Do and does, they come before the subject. And then we have a question. So let's take a look at the subjects. I, you, he, she, it, we, you, they. They are all subjects. If I want to make a question in English, in the present simple, we will have to say, do I, do you, do we, do you, do they. But for he, she, and it, we don't use do, we use does. Does he, does she, does it. And after that we have a verb. The verb here follows the same as what happens here. You see, the verb never changes, not even for he, she, and it, because we have doesn't here making the difference. Here we have does making the difference, so it doesn't change. If I want to say, eu estudo, do I study? Let's use black. Do I study? Do you study? Does he study? Does she study? Does it study? Do we study? Do you study? Do they study? Of course, the intonation here goes up because it's a question. So we say, do they study? Does he study? The intonation goes up, okay? And by doing this, we have what we call yes, no questions. Yes, no questions. It means that the answers for those questions are either yes or no. Do you study? Yes. Yes, I do. No. No, I don't. There are only two possible answers. But you can, if you want, and if you want to ask information questions, if you want to ask an information question, not a yes, no question, a question that you need some more details. For example, if I ask, where do you study? It's not possible to answer with a yes or with a no, right? Because we need some new information. If you want to make those kind of questions, before the auxiliary here, you've got to use the WH words. What? For example, what do you study? What do you study? And this is not a yes, no question anymore. This is an information question. And remember that the intonation of information questions, it goes down. So I say, what do you study? Which is different from saying, do you study? Do you study? Yes, no question. What do you study? Information question. Or, where do you study? O que você estuda? Onde você estuda? Quando você estuda? When do you study? When does he study? Okay? What time? Que horas? What time do you study? What time do they study? And so on, so on. Guys, I really hope that this has helped you somehow. If you have any questions, just text me a message right now, okay? Bye-bye, see you next class.